let me intro it this way, with kind of a form of a devotional a bit that will then lead into our lesson, because we ended right about here. You don't know it from the slides, but leading up to this, there was a really massive riot. A really massive riot. Just setting it up for you, the reason that we had this massive riot is, does anyone even know? No big deal, but you get bonus points if you can pinpoint, those of you who were here last time, what city are we in? Do we know what city we're in?
Ephesus.
Ephesus. Bingo, he gets 5 bonus points. You get 5 bonus points. Well, you can take that right to the bank. 5 bonus points. You can go to Brandon, be like, I want to redeem my bonus points. He may look confused, but you just keep that.
I have a free coupon for free popcorn.
See there?
Yeah.
There we are.
Take care of you.
Ephesus. And there, the dominant goddess is Artemis. Artemis of the Ephesians. Okay? And Paul is there, and he's having great success in bringing people to the Lord. Well, a guy named, I think, Demetrius leads this massive riot of silversmiths and then the entire city, saying if Paul is really successful, people will stop buying our silver idols of Artemis, and maybe one day no one even worships Artemis anymore. And so leads this massive riot, which Paul was not actually in and part of the riot, but he wanted to enter it and to address this frothing mob, but the disciples wouldn't let him. And even, so some of the followers of Jesus would not let him, and even some of the provincial authorities who aren't disciples, but they're still friends with Paul, but they're his friends, they sent a message saying don't go in there either. Now, eventually, the riot calmed down, right? We saw that the secretary of the city, who, I think, uncertain... I think, if I remember the commentaries I read correctly, kind of like a secretary of state, kind of not quite a mayor, but something similar. A little less rank, came out and addressed the crowds, and they all dispersed. Basically said, hey guys, this riot is completely unjustified, and if we don't stop now, Rome is going to send in the garrison, and nobody wants that. Okay? But I think it's interesting to note how far Paul's come. Right? You see, before Paul's conversion, he was the right hand of the Pharisees and Sadducees. All of his needs were met. Financially, physically, like he got all expense paid trips to wherever to continue his persecution, and vigorously persecuted the brothers. He had all the power and authority and money he could want. Like, he was basically the right hand of the power base, and he had kind of a bottomless source of wealth. After his conversion, well, he doesn't really have any physical power anymore. He's no longer operating on behalf of a religious, on the behalf of a political body, and he only has as much financial support as he is given, and sometimes he's had to work. And he's persecuted by Jews, but then as this incident illustrated, he's also persecuted by Gentiles too. So before he was kind of unquestioned, and now here he is, and yet he's guided by God. He's supported financially by new churches. And the disciples who he persecuted are now protecting him, and Gentiles who don't even believe are protecting him. So it's this one thing where by the world standards he was on top, and by the world standards now he's totally bottomed out. But by God's standards we see something very different. We see a different kind of success. Let me make you an analogy. There's this guy named Dieter Zander. Dieter Zander. It's a real name. It really is. in Germany. These are names, okay? This guy is not from Germany. Dieter Zander was a very popular pastor and music minister at Willow Creek, the massive mega church that has about a zillion Christians in it and has like satellite campuses all over the place and does that big Willow Creek Association thing every year, leadership conference. And he was one of the more popular pastors and music ministers. He had weekly he would preach and perform his music for thousands of people. Those of you who know, like, pastoring is not a profitable thing. So for someone like him, I mean, in terms of like the ministry world, he's pretty much at the top of the heap. Like, if you can be a popular minister of Willow Creek, that's a big audience. That's a pretty good income as far as being a pastor goes. He was doing really well. Then the stroke happened. When the stroke happened, two things happened to Dieter. First, his right hand became paralyzed. He had played the piano and other instruments before. He could no longer do that. So his music ministry was gone. The other thing that happened with the stroke is he got aphasia. If you don't know what aphasia is, it affected his brain such that he can't put words together right. Sometimes when he speaks, just gibberish words will come out. In his mind, he is saying the right thing, but then what comes out is a jumble of words. He could no longer preach. He could no longer be a pastor. Dieter now works and has been working, so he lost that job. He had to leave that, and now is a clerk and custodian for a Trader Joe's. So we hear this, and again, the one thing that we would think of is just colossal loss, right? Like, we would think of that, you just being on top of kind of the ministry heap, and now working at a custodian at Trader Joe's, and we think, man, that's terrible. But we're thinking of it how the world thinks about it then, aren't we? Because that's the way the world thinks. The world thinks of it in these very tangible terms of success. And it's interesting how Dieter's journey has evolved. And there's this thing I want to share with you. And it's called The King. This is a thing that he wrote that he is having, because he cannot really say it himself. There's a person reading his words here. And the video, you're going to be seeing him, but you're going to hear words reading what he wrote. And he entitled it The Kingdom of Cardboard and Spoils. Let me, hold on. Display, okay. One moment. There we go. We're fine. So, let me share this with you, and then I'm going to pray. I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to pray.
If I am the king of all I survey, then I am king of cardboard and spoils. My kingdom is a noisy, windowless room in the back of a Trader Joe's grocery store. Here are the haphazard stacks of empty cardboard boxes. Here is the giant box baler. Here are the shopping carts marked spoils, their wire frames brimming with still good fruit, meat, and flowers. In Dallas Willard's book, The Divine Conspiracy, he defines kingdom as a realm that is uniquely our own, where our choice determines what happens. My kingdom used to be a stage, a microphone, a piano, and an audience of thousands. My kingdom was a performance, King Dieter. Then came the stroke. Now, 5 days a week, I arrive at Trader Joe's in the early dark, hours before the sun cracks the horizon. I push my mop up and down aisles, sweep my broom into corners to collect the debris from the day before. There is no audience in this kingdom. But that's okay, because I'm not performing. There is no stage Dieter here, no Superman seeking to wow the masses with feats of spiritual strength. It's just me, just Dieter. The guy who mops the floor, who bales the empty cardboard boxes for recycling, who prepares the spoils for the Marin Food Bank. There's something beautiful about this simple, menial work, though. Take the food marked as spoils, for example. It's all still good. The fruit is good, the meat is good, the flowers are good, but they're not perfect. Anything that has an expiration date of today cannot be put out in the store for sale. And if a pear so much as rolls off the smooth green pyramid of fellow pears, it gets put in the spoils pile. It's not perfect anymore. So the Trader Joe's employees fill shiny carts with all this perfectly edible imperfection and wheel the load back to my kingdom. From there, it will go to feed the hungry, who won't care at all that their apple is lopsided, that their hamburger is in the waning stage of freshness. They don't care how it looks. They just want to eat. To me, this, here in this back room, this is what's real. Not the bright aisles of suburban shoppers making their menu selections from stacks of perfection. I understand the spoils. I can relate, because I too am spoils, over and over and over again. I used to be packaged as perfect. Back in the heyday of my church career, I was a shiny, unblemished apple. At least that's the image I polished up and displayed to the public. But now, stripped of my talent, my stage, and my six-figure salary, I relish the imperfection. I revel in the spoils. As I break down these empty squares of cardboard, abandoned boxes that once held and protected goods more valuable than themselves, I survey my kingdom and I am pleased. I come home after work and I think, it's good today. It's not a sermon. It's not a performance. It's not perfection. But the cardboard is recycled. The spoils are feeding the hungry. And today I'm thinking, life is good. It's very good.
How many of you right now are sitting there thinking that there's something in your life that's spoiled? Maybe like Dieter, it is a physical thing. It is a physical thing you're going through. You could do this and now you can't. Spoiled. Maybe it's a financial choice you made or did not make, but it's a financial thing that afflicts you now. Spoiled. Maybe it's an emotional thing, maybe a broken relationship for you. Maybe you screwed up somewhere down the line. You had a good relationship with a friend or family member, and you don't anymore. Spoiled. When we think of ourselves and we think of these things, and what have we given up for lost? Because to us it is spoiled, and we look at our lives and we say, spoiled, spoiled, spoiled. But that's the world talking. It's the world talking. The Lord took us in our imperfections, made something of us, and we help the people around us. We feed hungry people through the love that we share with them for the good that we do. We feed hungry people. We're not spoiled. The Lord makes things of us every day. We live in a world that demands perfection and tells us that if we're not perfect, we are spoiled. We're not spoiled. Sovereign Master, help us to know the truth. We are not spoiled, Lord. You see nothing as spoiled. Thank you, Lord, for all that you've done for us. Help us, forgive us, Lord, that we have not looked at ourselves as we should have. We have looked at ourselves and our own relationships and our own lives with the eyes of the world. And we have too often looked at the things of our lives and written them off and said, spoiled. But we did that without you, Lord, and we ask forgiveness because that's not how you see us. God, please help us to see ourselves and others with your eyes. Help us to see our relationships with your eyes. Help us to look upon others and ourselves with the eyes of Jesus. And help us to know we are not spoiled. We're redeemed and we're perfected. And we're perfect in your eyes. Thank you, Lord, for loving us in the midst of our imperfections. Thank you for taking us and making us something beautiful. Help us to learn during this time. Teach us things we need to know. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Just some words for you today. Let's begin Acts 20. After the disturbance had ended, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, saying farewell, he left to go to Macedonia. Again, I'm going to ask for apologies for this awful map of Paul's third missionary journey. I got really great ones for the first two, and just a dreadful one for the third. I'm very sorry. Please forgive me. But we started our third missionary journey here in Vegas, Antioch, and we went back through a lot of places they'd been, and we were just in Ephesus, but now we're going to go to Macedonia. Whoop! That's where we have the Philippian church and the Thessalonian church. Macedonia's got a lot of good stuff going on. Those are some good churches. So we're going to go back to those. We're going to go back to those places. Eventually, we're going to kind of do a little circuit around here and then go out. We're going to visit a lot of these churches. After he'd gone through those regions and spoken many words of encouragement to the believers there, he came to Greece, where he stayed for 3 months. Remember, that's where we had Athens. We had that big speech in Athens, those pagans with all the idols. And this is where, it's from this time that the letter to the Romans is written. So he wrote the letter to the Roman believers, not having ever gone there. He actually talks in Romans about, I really would like to see y'all soon. But this is when he's writing Romans in the anticipation that one day he will go there. And we actually know that from reading the later parts of Romans that it says, for Macedonia and Achaia are pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem. So we're hearing there, from Romans, we're hearing that the Macedonian believers, the Thessalonian believers, and the Philippian believers are very generous. We know that they've supported Paul in the past, even when they didn't have to. And in this case, they're gathering a love offering for the poor among the Jerusalem that's like a world away from their perspective. Most of them have never even been to Jerusalem, but they care intensely for their brothers and sisters that are poor in Jerusalem, and so they're collecting a love offering for them. And because the Jews, back to Acts, had made a plot against him as he was intending to sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Great. And he's got Sopater, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, and Timothy, good, so Timothy's back, as well as Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. Those had gone on ahead and were waiting for us in Troas. And then we, wait for it, we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and within 5 days we came to the others in Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Remind me, who's we? When we say we, who's talking now? Luke! Luke is back! Our friend Luke. Now there is one characteristic of Luke. Let's see if you can catch it from the art. Luke has a friend that frequently accompanies him in the art. Let's see if you catch it. Oh, Luke. There's Luke there. Some more Luke. Yeah, there's Luke. I don't know if you've caught it yet. Luke. Yeah. Okay. And then some more Luke there. Yeah. Yeah. And more Luke. Yeah. And when I did this to Rosa the first time I made this, and I was like, "Do you notice anything common?" And she's like, "Is it the random cow?" Yes, it is the random cow. So, fun fact, if somewhere down the line in like Roman Catholic art, all the saints and apostles become attributed with an animal or an object or something like that that kind of describes their personality. And for Luke, it's a bull. So, that. Luke and his random cow. Alright? So, there you are. Paul gets this super awesome sword, so when you see him, like, he's like carrying a sword around in the old artwork that you see of Paul. Luke got the short straw and got the cow. You know? Now, what you gonna do? Sorry, Luke. I think it's supposed to mean, like, loyalty and determination or something like that. So.
I thought bulls are stubborn.
Apparently not that one. That one is very loyal and determined. Okay. Now I don't know. Now, on the first day of the week, when we met, so again, Luke was part of the travels before. Then Paul left him in Macedonia. Paul's come back to Macedonia, so Luke is now traveling with him around Greece. So Luke's part of the company. So it's kind of cool. You know, some things Luke is retelling based on the account of others. Other things he got to witness firsthand. So these things he got to witness firsthand. So, on the first day of the week when we met to break bread, Paul began to speak to the people because he intended to leave the next day. He extended his message until midnight. I don't want to hear anyone complaining about the length of Brandon's sermons ever again. I don't want to hear any complaints. Paul's preaching till midnight. Now, there were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. I hope there were plenty of bathroom breaks. Because, man, This is the first day of the week. This is our first instance of Sunday worship. So this is our first example in Scripture where we stopped worshiping on the Jewish Sabbath of Saturday and we started worshiping on Sunday. We did this because it was the day that Jesus was raised from the dead. And so it seemed fitting. So that's why we did it. We did not have to do this day. We could have kept on worshiping on Saturday. We could have picked Wednesday. God wanted us to pick a day and make it holy, right? Like, it didn't matter which day it was, but this is why we chose that day, because it was the day Jesus raised from the dead. Again, Christianity is kind of originated in Judaism, but now it's kind of becoming its own thing. So this is one of the things they did different. Because in John, again, on the evening of that day, the first day of the week, so even after Jesus had just died and raised, but then he's kind of flitting in and out, the disciples had gathered together, and then Jesus came and appeared among them. But again, they were gathered together on the first day. Later in John, 8 days later, the disciples were again together in the house on the first day of the week, because it would have been 8 days later, and Thomas was with them. And then Jesus came and stood among them. And then in 1 Corinthians, we've got an example of Sunday worship on the first day of the week. Each of you should set aside some income and save it to the extent that God has blessed you. So now Paul is giving spiritual instruction with the understanding that, wow, most Christians, they're starting to meet on Sundays now. So Christians just started doing it, and it became a thing, and it stayed a thing. And that's why we worship on Sundays, because it was the day that Jesus rose from the dead. A young man named Eutychus, who was sitting in the window, was sinking into a deep sleep while Paul continued to speak for a long time. Young man, This is ages 8 to 14. Okay. My advice as a parent, don't do this. If you see your kids sitting in the window, don't let them do that. Take them out. So just words for me. Children sitting in window while they listen to sermon, bad idea. It's just me. But apparently they didn't really think this through at the time. So Eutychus there sitting in the window, falling into a deep sleep. And fast asleep he fell down from the 3rd story and was picked up dead.
Wow.
Don't worry, it gets better.
But Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, put his arms around him and said, "Do not be distressed, for he is still alive." Then Paul went back upstairs, and after he had broken bread and eaten, he talked with them a long time until dawn, then he left. Now, it's interesting, if you had not read verse 12, it doesn't actually say that the boy came back to life. It just said that Paul went up and, ate. So, if you just had verses that, you'd be like, don't worry, he's alive. I'm going to go back and eat. You started, eating then. But in verse 12, we see that they took the boy home alive and were greatly comforted. And then they went and slept because they'd been up all night listening to Paul preach. Okay. Yeah, and then he kept talking with them until dawn. It was an all-nighter. They pulled an all-night preaching session.
So Paul didn't alter his long sermons anymore. He continued to do that.
In this instance, apparently a boy dying in the middle of his sermon did not deter him, and he just kept on
Around
preaching.
11, you could listen to him for an hour then.
So yeah, I guess 45-minute sermons don't seem that bad now,
Yeah,
do
there
they?
you go.
Breaking bread. This is what the Lord's Supper looked like. It was a meal, but it was also communion. So I want you to imagine if we were to all get together and have dinner and eat a meal, and then at the end of the meal, we had communion at the end of the meal. So we would have a loaf of bread at the end of the meal, and we would break some of that bread and spread it around. We don't do this anymore. The Lord's Supper does not look like this for us for now. But we see all the way back to Acts 2, they were devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. And so this is a meal, but then this is also the Lord's Supper. I'm going to show you. We're doing lots of multimedia today, more than I normally do. But I want to use this. I want to show you. I want to give you an example of what the early church looked like when it did the Lord's Supper, because I want us to be able to rethink and to dream bigger of what the Lord's Supper could look like. Not what it has to look like. I think the Lord's Supper can look like several different things in different cultures, but I want us to think of what it could look like, because in many ways the Lord's Supper does not look like what it did in Acts. We no longer get together over a meal and have communion at the end of it. Now there is no meal at all, right? This St. Lydia's Dinner Church is a kind of house church in Brooklyn. It is part of the Evangelical Lutheran Church denomination, okay? And I don't agree with because of that, I don't agree with everything that they believe are their doctrine, so I'm not perfectly aligned with them. There's some areas looking through doctrine, I'm like, well, this I agree, a little but like you would with any denomination, right? But the reason I show you this is not because I want us all to leave Portland first and fly to Brooklyn and go there, but I want to show you an example of what they do. They formed their church around this concept. And it's called St. Lydia's Dinner Church. Let me show you a clip from their website. When I show you this, pay attention to the elements that go into this service. Pay attention to what they do, the parts of it.
One of the things I love the most about St. Lydia's is that it's a thing still in the process of becoming, and that's part of its identity.
Our central act at St. Lydia's is to gather together around a meal and around a table. The idea is that when we're at this table together, there's a way in which we're practicing for how we'd like to be when we're out in the world. So it's a table where we learn how to feed one another and where we learn how to be fed. It's a table where we learn to be compassionate with one another and patient with one another. And it's a table where we learn to be open to God's presence and to spend time sort of feeling that movement and that presence in our lives.
We start our worship by gathering around a central candle and singing a lamp lighting hymn. And we all light our own candles from that one central candle and pass the fire from one person to the next. And then as we sing, we process to the tables and light all the candles on the tables. And by doing that, we all get to participate in marking this space as sacred.
So there's a story in the book of Luke that's about Jesus after the resurrection meeting two disciples on the road, and they don't recognize him. And what happens is that they come together for dinner, and when they sit down at the table, Jesus breaks bread. And it says that he was known to them in the breaking of the bread, that in the moment that the bread broke, the disciples recognized Christ. This is my body. And that's really the story that's at the heart of everything that we do together, that when we gather together at this table and when we break bread and share it, there's a sense that Christ is in our midst. And not only is Christ there with us at the table, but he's also present in each of us so that we can be Christ to one another.
Earlier in my life, I had an idea that going to church meant making certain proclamations and adhering to certain theories. But being at St. Lydia's and sitting down every week next to strangers, I found that in that moment, when I pass the bread and the bread is passed to me, that God is present and I feel connected to something bigger than myself.
And Jesus stands on the shore of the gray morning in the dawn, the same hour that he appeared to Mary Magdalene in the garden. Dawn, when the night is not quite over, but the day has not quite begun. He appears, inhabiting this in-between time when darkness and light are intermingled. His question to the disciples breaks my heart. Children, you have no fish, have you? And they answer him, no, we have been fishing all night and we haven't caught anything. When the catch comes in, it is more than they could have ever dreamed of, more than they could ever consume. And still, we are told, the net does not tear.
I think St. Lydia's appeals to people who maybe live far away from family and either emotionally or geographically and crave a home-cooked meal in the company of people who will accept them for who they are, no matter what they are.
So we finish our worship by everyone in the congregation helping to clean up all the food and the dishes and all the big mess that we've made. And that's one of my favorite moments in the service because I think there's a way in which you can kind of see the community that's been formed over the course of the evening, that when we came together at the beginning of the night, we were strangers to one another, and by the end of the night, we're friends.
I think that there's a big emphasis in our culture on the finished product, but I've realized that I learned something from the process of making something, and that's really where the value is for me in being an artist. And I think that's true at St. Lydia's as well. By making church together every week, we learn about ourselves, and it doesn't really matter if the singing sounds perfect or if the food tastes perfect or, it's really matters that we did it and that we wrestled with it for a while together.
Holy food for holy people. Share in the meal.
What do you think? Let's discuss. If we were to reimagine those, what did you take from that? What did you notice that was different? Thoughts did you have?
There must be new people in the group each week for them not to know each other really well. You would think they might have.
Maybe.
I thought it was really cool the way, they're having dinner together, but it seemed to me from the start of as the preparation's going on, they're like singing. They're like really joining together in worship. And it was like, wow, that was really powerful, I thought.
I think there was a real meaning that we miss in the times of Christ, of what it meant to recline with each other, to eat. It's just, there's just such a deepness there that we don't get, I don't think.
Yeah, I think especially when, like, back then, that seat, like, pews were all seated next to each other. It is far from comfortable, and we have like space, but this reclining that he's talking about, we're all on benches, and we're kind of like this when we were reclining. Like that was the way they would have eaten, and they would have thought of nothing, which is why when John leans over to Jesus and like talks to him like this, it's a very intimate conversation because they're right next to each other, right? And yeah, that is a great call out. In terms of what they do, there's another video on Vimeo that's like 15 minutes long that kind of breaks. You can see the service in parts, but just to summarize, there's no volunteer rotation here in terms of preparation. They come together, they prepare the meal all together. They set the table all together. They all prepare it together. Then they stand and they sing songs to open, and you saw the lighting of the candles to consecrate that space. And then they come together and they eat. And they come together and they eat, and they hear a sermon. You saw Emily doing that there, a sermon. And there will be a sermon, and then they'll just talk with each other for a while, and then there will be communion that they will share and administer to each other. And then they will have a time of prayer, and then they will dismiss, and then they all clean up together, and then they'll dismiss. Other thoughts?
This is a process, like she mentioned about a process and not a finished product.
Right.
So much of what we do is the product or rushing to get to the product. And it's, I kind of wonder if I was in that situation, would I be willing to chat along while I'm trying to we're supposed to get something done. But,
right.
But in contrasting to the closest thing that we usually have is potlucks or special meals or whatever, and very much at those times the focus is get your food, eat your food, then then there might be mingling.
And that is very outside the context of worship. Yes. That is separate from our worship, right? That is after the worship is done and we've all gone down to the gym. Right? That is not, we would never do that in the sanctuary.
So they don't have a volunteer sign-in sheet?
No, they all do it. Yeah. I think there's a real, and again, we do, I'm coming across perhaps right now as being maybe extra critical of what we do, and I think I don't want, like, I am, but then at the same time I'm not. Like, there's a reason for what we do. We pay a lot of attention as a pastoral staff to the flow of a service and really making it worshipful and meaningful. So this is not something we've overthought, but I think there is always space sometimes to reimagine the elements that go into worship. And I think one thing that I really take from that when I look at it is the community that goes into the Lord's Supper. That I just wonder if, I think when we think of the Lord's Supper, I just wonder if that same community exists for us. Like, now we spend a lot of the Lord's Supper with encouragement to search our own thoughts and minds, our own. So there's this individualist thing. We're encouraged to look inward, which is important. That's scriptural, that we're supposed to search ourselves carefully when we take communion. But could we also do that in the process of community, in the process of church community? Is there something that we could do with the Lord's Supper where it could be more communal and different than it is, and yet at the same time still be very spiritually meaningful for us?
Another part that struck me was practicing how you would want to be acting in outside of. It's kind of like a safe zone of practicing being Christ in your own community.
Yeah.
To have the attentiveness to His moving, and then the other key item was practicing so that when you go out, that you're ready for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think how much is it a part of us where we behave at church in one fashion, but then we leave that when we go and we live out the rest of our week in a completely different fashion. We do not even try to seek the same kind of community we would have here.
I don't mean to put the downer in the thing, but
Please,
I think
go ahead.
that some people might find it rather challenging and difficult to be in that situation.
Okay. If you don't mind me putting you on the spot, tell me how you would feel. What would be uncomfortable for you? Just this is not a wrong, you have not just given the wrong answer, and I'm not trying to embarrass you. What would flesh out how you would feel?
Well, I'm kind of a bit more reserved. I wouldn't feel
Sure.
like I don't know what to do or what to say or what to. I kind of like to watch and see, and it's just a personality of holding back and I don't know what I'm saying. It's just
it's okay.
I would find it difficult to walk in and I would probably want to find a chair somewhere and sit down.
If you were just there, it would be very new to you. You would probably be asking, like, what happens now? I think a similar thing happens when we go into, like, if we go from this tradition, maybe we go to a Catholic church or we go to an Orthodox church, and things are happening that we don't understand, and people are standing and they're sitting and they're saying certain things from memory, and we don't know what's going on. And some of the same thing would happen there. I think also it's very interesting that worship was very participatory. There was a lot of participation. You're involved in a very real way that we might not be now. We're participating in a very different way now.
Yeah, like, we need you to cut the mushrooms up.
Well, no,
You
maybe,
get started with that, you're all of a sudden you're part of this
but
group.
maybe it's for some people, it's
Sure.
being there, watching being there, watching it happen,
Mhm.
gradually acclimating yourself to be a part of it.
Mhm.
You
Yeah.
just can't throw some people in the pot.
Right.
You know?
But, and one could say that for any new church community that they might go into. You go to any new church and you're trying to figure it out. I think,
Actually,
and again, oh, go ahead. I think, and I don't put this out there as like this is the model that we should aspire to. I want to be very clear. But I think it's interesting. Food for thought. See what I did? Yeah. In that I think that sometimes I think we could reimagine certain things. I think also my pet, in the same way that, you know, whenever we bring up baptism and Tad is here, like you could tell he's very passionate around baptism and the need to do it very urgently. The Lord's Supper is kind of like my issue along that way. You know, in this instance, like when the early church met, they broke bread. When the people there meet, they do the Lord's Supper each time they meet. And in many of our churches, and for us, you know, communion is what here is a monthly. It is a monthly thing, and for some churches, it is even longer than that. Sometimes some of them do it just quarterly or something like that. And I think it's very telling that in the early church, if you met, you broke bread and you had the Lord's Supper. And it was a salient, defining thing of when we as a people met. This is something that we did every time. We did this in remembrance of the Lord. We did this in remembrance of the Lord. And we did this for a very long time. When we met, you just expected we were going to do this. And you can go to some traditions where every single, like, I spent a semester at Oxford. And I was I joined the closest church nearby was kind of, it was an Anglican church. It was like an evangelical style Anglican church. It was still very Anglican. So because it was Church of England, every single time you met, you did communion. Each and every time. Even when we met for like morning Bible studies, we did communion. And when they'd have lunch, like the bread and wine was there each and every time they met. Because when they met, that's what you did. We do things for certain ways, and I think there are ways also, and I've experienced ways where you can do communion every single Sunday and do it such that it means little to the people. You can certainly do that. But I think, again, as we give ourselves freedom, I think that one area, like Brandon talks about crazy bold prayers, we have to pray these crazy bold prayers because on some level for the church, there's been, I'm going to call it a failure of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
We've had a failure of imagination. We're so used to church being a certain way that we've just stopped being able to imagine what it could be like if it were more or better or different. And we just can't because there's such strict confines of what we feel like church can be and not be that we've stopped being able to like imagine what it could look like any other way. And I think that as you're going through this series, that this Crazy Bold Prayers is going to last a few more weeks. And I want to give you permission to pray bold prayers, dream big about what the church could be. Maybe that involves taking some things that this church has done for a long time, and maybe that's just reducing them all to formula, and maybe we start over with something different. Maybe we don't. But give yourself freedom to think about it. Maybe we've been doing something wrong, we should be doing different. Maybe there's some way we could be so much better. We won't know unless we dream. Unless we give ourselves freedom to dream and imagine and pray to the Lord. Lord, what would it look like if we reached like 10,000 people in Portland? Like, what would it look like if suddenly, like, there were people filling up the balcony? Like, what could we be? Say our communion could be really a whole lot better. Lord, give us some new imagination for what that looks like. And maybe our sermons and our kids ministry and maybe our youth ministry, maybe we could be doing it way better. Lord, give us new inspiration and imagination for what that could look like. But it has to start with our willingness to ask, Lord, you know what, Lord? Just blow the boundaries beyond what we're so used to. And let's dream. There's the Lord's Supper to get you started. You could look at any number of other things in other areas. Have a good evening.